We thought we knew the Whippet, a lean, elegant breed designed for nothing but speed. But when scientists finally sequenced the DNA of this dog, they didn't just find a racing machine. They found a genetic archive that suggests an ancestry far more complex and shocking than history books ever recorded. Here is what the DNA actually revealed. For years, the breed could be seen in the same silhouette. Lean, elegant, almost fragile at a glance, a dog built for speed and nothing else. But in 2007, that simple image cracked open. A landmark study led by researchers like Dana Mosher and Elaine Ostrander at the NIH identified a mutation in the myostatin gene, MSTN, and the result was not a minor detail tucked away in a lab report. It was a very different kind of Whippet, one with a visibly thicker build, the so-called bully Whippet, carrying more muscle and, in heterozygous dogs, better racing performance than expected. That single finding changed the tone of the entire question. If one breed that seemed so uniform could contain such a strong biological split, then the story of the Whippet was already more complicated than its outline suggested. The body of the dog was telling one story, the DNA was telling another. And that gap between appearance and inheritance was exactly where the deeper mystery began. The study did more than name a mutation. It exposed a hidden lever inside the breed's biology, one capable of shifting muscle mass and altering athletic ability in a dog already known for its speed. In other words, the Whippet was not simply fast because people had bred it to be fast. Its genome was carrying a precise mechanism that could amplify the very traits racers cared about. That mattered, because it meant the breed's talent was not just a matter of training or shape. It was written into the animal at a far more fundamental level. And once that fact came into view, the obvious question became harder to ignore. If the Whippet could conceal this kind of variation under a familiar exterior, what else had been overlooked? How many of its defining traits were visible only because science finally looked beneath the surface? The sleek runner in the track ring suddenly felt less like a finished answer and more like the opening line of a longer investigation. The 2007 paper published in PLOS Genetics, titled "A Mutation in the Myostatin Gene Increases Muscle Mass and Enhances Racing Performance in Heterozygote Dogs," firmly established the breed's new biological landmark. It placed the Whippet inside a sharper frame, not as a simple example of canine speed, but as evidence that selection can shape performance with almost surgical precision. A single gene, a measurable effect, and a phenotype that startled even specialists. That is where the unease begins, because once a breed proves it can hide such a dramatic variant, the confidence around its history starts to wobble. The Whippet had always seemed easy to read. Now it looked like a dog with a concealed archive in its own body. The question was no longer only why it runs so well. The harder question was, what kind of ancestry could produce a breed capable of holding both delicacy and power in the same frame? And the deeper scientists went, the stranger that answer became. At first, the bully Whippet might seem like a side note, a rare exception with an unusual build. But exceptions are often where the real story begins. They reveal the structure that normal appearances hide. They show which traits are fixed, which are flexible, and which are the result of selection pushing biology farther than anyone expected. In the Whippet, the mutation in MSTN did exactly that. It turned a familiar racing dog into a clue. So the mystery shifted. The breed was no longer just an icon of agility. It was proof that DNA could expose an architecture of inheritance invisible to the eye. And if that was true for muscle, it could be true for origin as well. The next step was unavoidable, to follow the trail from one startling mutation to the larger genetic history behind the Whippet itself. The first real break in the case did not come from a museum drawer or an old breeding record. It came from blood, scanned through a 2015 study in PLOS-1, where Whippet samples pointed investigators toward chromosome 15. There, a locus was tied to the severity of mitral valve degeneration, the heart disease better known as MVD. For a dog, long admired for clean lines, speed, and silence in motion, that finding carried a sharp new implication. The same genome that shaped grace could also carry a measurable risk of decline. This was more than a veterinary footnote. It meant that, in Whippets, inheritance could be followed at two very different scales at once. One layer explained how a body is built to sprint. Another hinted at why that body might fail in a very specific way later in life. And once scientists saw that pattern, the breed stopped looking genetically simple. It became a map with marked regions, some visible in posture and muscle, others hidden until disease brought them into view. The 2015 result also changed the tone of the investigation. Before that, the story around Whippets often leaned on appearance. People saw a lean frame, narrow head, flexible spine, and the kind of acceleration that seemed almost impossible for such a light dog. But chromosome 15 introduced a harder truth. The shape of a Whippet was not just a matter of beauty or function. It was also evidence that selection had left fingerprints deep inside the genome, fingerprints precise enough for researchers to link to the progression of a heart condition. That is why the study mattered so much. It showed that the Whippet could not be read only by looking at the body in motion. The heart, too, had to be included in the picture. And once the heart entered the story, the question of origin became more complicated. If one part of the genome could help explain racing form, and another could help explain disease severity, then the ancestry behind the breed had to be equally layered. The old image of a tidy lineage began to give way to something less convenient and far more revealing. Researchers were no longer dealing with a single trait or a single surprise. They were watching evidence accumulate across different parts of the same animal, each clue narrowing the gap between assumption and reality. In that sense, the chromosome 15 discovery did what every serious genetic finding does. It forced the story to become less romantic and more exact. It replaced guesswork with location, suspicion with locus, and vague tradition with a measurable association. And that mattered, because Whippets had already been cast as a breed defined by refinement. Their reputation came from what the eye could catch instantly: the hollow at the waist, the poised chest, the explosive stride. But the PLOS-1 study made it impossible to stop there. It suggested that underneath those familiar features sat a genome that could be tracked, segmented, and compared. The dog was not just an icon of speed. It was also a record of inherited vulnerability, written in the same biological language as its athletic gifts. That is the unsettling part. Once a breed begins to yield one genetic secret, scientists naturally ask what else has been hidden in plain sight. If a locus on chromosome 15 could be associated with the severity of MVD in Whippets, then what else in the breed's history might have a genomic signature? Where did the chain of selection begin, and how far back did it go before the modern Whippet took shape? The answer was not going to come from appearance alone. It would have to come from the deeper ancestry that produced both the body and the risks carried inside it. So the investigation moved forward with a new kind of pressure. The visible dog was no longer enough. Every elegant line now suggested a prior decision, every fast twitch muscle a longer inheritance, every medical vulnerability a possible trace of breeding choices made years earlier. The chromosome 15 study did not settle the mystery of origin, but it narrowed the path toward it. It proved that the Whippet's identity was already encoded in ways most observers would never notice, and that the next revelation would have to dig beneath performance into ancestry itself. Then, a different weakness surfaced, and it had nothing to do with speed. In 2017, a team led by researchers such as Sommer et al. In veterinary ophthalmology reported a unique form of progressive retinal atrophy, PRA, a disorder that quietly erodes vision until a dog that looks healthy begins to lose the world around it. The paper did not rely on a single clue. It brought together clinical examination, electroretinography, and tomography, so the pattern could be seen from several angles at once. In other words, this was not a vague suspicion based on a few dim pupils or an owner's concern. It was a mapped-out biological defect, recorded in detail and connected to a breed already thought to be well understood. That mattered because the Whippet had already been framed by earlier surprises: muscle variation, performance differences, inherited health risk. But retinal degeneration pushed the question into a new territory. A breed can be admired for shape, for pace, for balance in motion. It is harder to keep that image intact when another inherited condition appears in the visual system itself. If one hidden trait could reshape expectations about power, another could reshape expectations about vulnerability, and this one was not isolated to a single dog. The study treated it as a breeding problem, which immediately raised a difficult possibility. The condition was likely moving through family lines rather than appearing by chance. The authors suggested autosomal recessive inheritance. That detail changed the tone of the evidence. a recessive trait can remain silent for generations, carried by dogs that show no obvious sign while still passing the variant onward. So the affected Whippet was not just an individual case, it was a clue to a deeper pattern hidden in the population. Two healthy parents could produce an affected litter. A line that seemed clean on the surface could still hold the same risk in both carriers. Suddenly, the breed's story was no longer only about form and function. It was about invisible transmission, about a genetic fault line that could stay buried until the right pairing made it visible. The study's value was not only that it identified a new retinal syndrome, it showed how quickly the idea of a uniform Whippet collapses once the data are examined closely. The dogs in the report did not fit a simple picture of one shared background and one stable inheritance path. Their eyes told a more complicated story, one that needed laboratory tools to read correctly. Clinical signs established that something was wrong. Electroretinography measured the failure of the retina to respond as expected. Tomographic images added structural evidence. Together, those layers made the condition harder to dismiss and easier to place inside the breed's broader history. That broader history was becoming the real subject. The Whippet was beginning to look less like a single genetic design and more like a breed assembled through overlapping choices, with certain lines carrying advantages and others carrying costs that had never been obvious from the outside. Once retinal disease was added to the picture, the earlier assumptions started to weaken. It was not enough to say that Whippets were simply sleek, fast, and refined. The genetics were showing something messier: hidden diversity, inherited risk, and biological variation that could surface in very different parts of the body. And the timing of this discovery made it even more striking. By 2017, the breed had already been studied for traits tied to muscle and health, yet a new inherited eye disorder still emerged from a separate population context. That meant the genetic map was far from complete. It also meant the next answer could not be a tidy origin tale built from appearance alone. The breed was revealing itself in fragments, each one forcing researchers to revise what they thought they knew. The Whippet was not just carrying a history of speed, it was carrying a hidden archive of inheritance, and this retinal study opened another page in that archive. What made the finding unsettling was its ordinary visibility. Owners can notice a dog's sprint, its outline, its grace. They cannot see the mutation until the signs start to appear in dim light, in hesitation, in a failed retinal response. By the time the problem is obvious, the genetic line may already be established. That is why the Brazilian report mattered so much. It turned a quiet vision disorder into evidence that the Whippet population had been shaped by more than one concealed pathway. The breed was not a single thread. It was a weave, and one more strand had just been exposed. The next clue did something the earlier papers could not. It pulled the Whippet out of a single breed frame and dropped it into a wider map of hunting dogs, where ancestry had to be read across regions instead of through one isolated mutation. In 2023, a study published in Molecular Biology and Evolution involving researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences examined the genomes of 123 sighthounds, including Whippets, and the pattern was anything but uniform. The dogs linked to Africa carried 17 genes under positive selection. The European group showed 27. The Middle Eastern group showed 54. Those numbers mattered because they pointed to more than one evolutionary pressure shaping speed, endurance, and body form in different places, at different times. That was the first real turn in the Whippet's origin puzzle, not because it erased what came before, but because it widened the lens. The breed's later muscle findings and inherited health findings had shown that hidden biology lived beneath the surface. This newer analysis asked a harder question: what if the surface itself was the result of multiple ancestral streams converging? What if the Whippet was not the product of a single clean line, but the outcome of regional histories that left distinct marks on the genome? The paper did not present the Whippet as an odd exception sitting apart from the rest of the group. It placed the breed inside a shared sighthound framework, and then showed that the framework itself was layered. Africa, Europe, and the Middle East were not interchangeable labels here. They were genomic settings with different signatures of selection, and that distinction forced a new reading of the breed. The Whippet's sleek frame and explosive acceleration could no longer be treated as a simple inheritance handed down in one place, then preserved unchanged. Instead, the evidence suggested a longer chain of refinement, one in which several populations contributed to the same broad athletic design. That is why the 17, 27, and 54 gene counts were so unsettling to older assumptions. They implied that the traits people associate with whippets and other sighthounds were not built by a single ancestral event. They were assembled through repeated selection, with different regions emphasizing different biological roots. In other words, the breed's elegance was not merely aesthetic. It was the visible result of a genome that had been worked on by geography, function, and time. For researchers, this mattered because it shifted the question from what makes a whippet look like a whippet to which ancestral populations helped create that look in the first place. Once that question was asked, the answer stopped being tidy. The whippet was not just a racing dog with a recognizable silhouette. It was part of a broader history of sighthounds, whose DNA carried traces of multiple origins. The 2023 analysis did not close the case. It exposed the structure of the case itself. And that new structure changed everything around the title question. If several hunting dog populations contributed different selection signatures, then the whippet's ancestry had to be understood as a convergence, not a single path. The breed's speed, its lean body, its sharp specialization, those features now looked less like a mystery of appearance and more like a genetic archive preserved in layers. What had seemed fixed was actually composite. What had seemed singular was already plural. That is the deeper shock of the 2023 finding. It did not merely add another data point, it redefined the whippet's place in canine history. The dog that looked so refined, so effortless in motion, now appears as the product of many hands of selection across several landscapes, and once that becomes visible, the old story of one origin starts to thin out, replaced by something far more intricate and far more human in its pattern of choice, movement, and inheritance. Then the picture widened again, and this time it did not come from a theory. It came from a panel of markers, from real dogs, from samples that crossed borders. In 2024, the Veterinary Genetics Laboratory, VGL, at UC Davis, led by Dr. Niels C. Pedersen, published a comprehensive whippet genetic diversity test built around short tandem repeat markers, the kind of tool that can expose how much variation still lives inside a breed that looks uniform at a glance. The dataset was not small, and it was not local. It covered 110 whippets from different countries, and when the team ran the comparison, the result was striking. Almost all available alleles were detected across 33 STR loci and 7 DLA Class 1 and 2 regions. That matters because a breed can carry a famous shape and still conceal a much broader genetic landscape underneath it. In the whippet, the evidence was pointing to exactly that. The sleek body, the precision built for speed, the clean outline people recognize instantly, those traits did not sit atop a narrow genetic bottleneck as neatly as old assumptions might suggest. Instead, the 2024 panel showed breadth. It showed that the whippet population preserved a large share of the variation available at the loci tested, enough to imply a history shaped by movement, exchange, and breeding choices made in more than one place. And that is where the story shifts from simple confirmation to deeper consequence. The earlier genomic signals had already hinted that the whippet was not a closed, single-threaded lineage. The 2024 data gave that idea a wider frame. If 110 dogs drawn from multiple countries still carried nearly every allele in those marker sets, then the breed's present-day diversity was not an accident. It was a record. It suggested that the whippet was never only a local kennel success or a narrow sporting refinement frozen in one region. It was a living population whose genetics still remembered repeated contact, selection, and redistribution. The University of California, Davis Page does something important by making that visible in practical terms. It turns abstract ancestry into a measurable pattern. A marker panel does not romanticize the past. It counts what remains. And what remained in these whippets was a surprisingly rich set of alleles across both the STR system and the DLA regions linked to immune-related variation. That combination does more than support the idea of multiple origins. It also shows that the breed's international spread did not erase its diversity the way some highly compressed breeding histories do. The whippet kept more of its genetic range than its elegance would lead you to expect. So the title question becomes sharper, not softer. What DNA revealed was not a single dramatic ancestor hidden in the shadows, but a broader ancestry that continued to leave marks in modern dogs. The 2024 test did not overturn the earlier findings. It extended them. It confirmed that the Whippet story is large enough to hold both selection and dispersal, both performance and persistence. One layer of the mystery has now been checked against real data. Another layer remains: how a breed so refined in appearance managed to preserve such width in its genetic memory. That tension is the real conclusion of this phase of the evidence. The Whippet looks narrow, almost sculpted from a single idea, yet its DNA tells a more generous history. Across 33 STR loci, 7 DLA regions, and dogs collected from different countries, the breed still carried almost every allele the panel could see. In other words, the Whippet did not arrive at modern identity by erasing its past. It arrived by carrying more of that past than anyone expected, and by letting science read the result with a clarity that old assumptions never had. And that is where the certainty starts to slip, because the most recent data did not point to a neat birthplace hidden behind the Whippet's elegance. It pointed to spread, retention, and a kind of genetic breadth that refuses a single, tidy origin story. In 2024, the Veterinary Genetics Laboratory at the University of California, Davis released a short tandem repeat panel built to measure diversity in Whippets. The sample was not small. It covered 110 Whippets, drawn from different countries, and it looked at 33 STR loci plus 7 DLA Class Y and 2 regions. What the lab found was startling in its own quiet way. Almost every allele available in that panel was still present in the breed. That result changes the question. The temptation had always been to imagine a clean beginning, a narrow foundation, one decisive source from which the modern Whippet emerged fully formed. But the panel made that idea harder to defend. If a breed keeps nearly all the alleles visible to a broad marker set, then its history is not a straight hallway leading back to a single door. It is a corridor with side passages, crossings, and older rooms still carrying traces of what came before. The Whippet, in other words, did not need to be explained by one origin point to make sense. It needed to be read as a population that preserved depth while being shaped for purpose. That is why the 2024 findings feel so important after the earlier surprises. The muscle mutation told us that speed could be sculpted by a very specific genetic change. The health studies showed that inherited risk could sit beside performance in the same breed. But this newer diversity panel pushes the story even further back and wider out. It suggests that refinement did not arrive by stripping away everything messy and old. It arrived through selection acting on a lineage that still carried a lot of its original range. The Whippet became lean, fast, and visually disciplined, yet its DNA never collapsed into a single note. The contrast is almost poetic, except the evidence is more stubborn than poetry. A dog that appears so exact, so balanced, so almost engineered for motion, still holds a broad internal archive. That is what almost all the alleles in 33 STR loci and 7 DLA regions imply. Not purity in the romantic sense, but resilience in the biological one. Not a sealed beginning, but a history that remained open long enough for scientists to detect it. And the location matters here too. This was not a vague claim drawn from theory. It came from a public 2024 genetic diversity test at UC Davis, a place known for reading canine variation with unusual precision. The Whippet was measured against markers that reveal how much variation survives inside a breed, and the answer was more generous than the old story allowed. Across those 110 dogs, the signal did not shrink into a minimal founder portrait. It stayed wide enough to suggest that the breed's modern form was built on top of a larger genetic landscape, rather than replacing it. That is the deeper reversal. The question is no longer simply where the Whippet came from. It is how a breed so specialized could keep so much of its earlier genetic memory while being shaped into something so recognizable. The answer, at least for now, is that selection did not erase the past. It curated it. The Whippet's body became more precise, but its genome kept room for history to survive. So the mystery does not end with a birthplace on a map. It moves inward, into the way inheritance can remain broad even when appearance becomes narrow. The Whippet still looks like a creature drawn with clean lines, but the DNA tells a rougher and more honest story, one of layers retained, markers dispersed, and identity formed through more than one path. That is why the breed shocked researchers. It was never just about speed. It was about how much of the old world was still hidden inside the new one, waiting for the right test to make it visible. The final answer is not a dramatic birthplace pinned to one corner of the map. It is stranger than that, and more complete. In 2024, the Veterinary Genetics Laboratory at the University of California, Davis, published a Whippet diversity panel built around short tandem repeat markers, and the result gave the breed a far less simplistic ending than people expected. Across 110 Whippets, the laboratory identified almost every allele present in 33 STR loci and 7 DLA class 1 and 2 regions. That matters because it means the breed was not reduced to a narrow genetic bottleneck. It carried breadth, and that breadth survived long enough to be measured. For a breed long admired for its clean outline, that finding changes the emotional shape of the story. A Whippet does not simply look refined. It comes from refinement layered over variation. The body that seems so spare is not evidence of emptiness. It is the product of choice, filtering, and preservation working together over time. The data from Davis did not flatten the Whippet into a single ancestry line. It showed that the modern breed can be traced through a distributed genetic background, one broad enough to retain nearly all the alleles the study was looking for. That is a very different kind of truth from the tidy legend people often want, and it explains why the earlier clues mattered so much. The muscular surprises, the inherited health signals, the retinal disorder, the wider sighthound comparisons, the international diversity signals, and now this 2024 Whippet panel all point in the same direction. The breed's history is not a single clean corridor, but a corridor with side doors left open. Selection did its work, but it did not erase everything that came before it. It shaped a racer, yes, yet it also preserved enough underlying diversity to reveal a more complicated past when the right tools were used. That is the part that truly reframes the title's promise. What DNA revealed was not a hidden family tree with one shocking root. It was a deeper fact about how a breed can become iconic without becoming genetically simple. The Whippet's elegance did not come from the disappearance of history. It came from history being organized, narrowed in appearance, and still retained in the genome. The visible dog became specialized. The invisible record stayed wide. Seen that way, the surprise is not that researchers found complexity. The surprise is that the Whippet kept so much of it. A race-bred silhouette can look final, almost self-explanatory, yet the DNA says otherwise. It says this breed was assembled, refined, and carried forward with more memory than its outline suggests. It says the answer was never going to be a single origin story. It was always going to be a record of selection meeting inheritance, and of both forces leaving their mark. So the true ancestry of the Whippet is not a myth destroyed by science. It is a story made larger by it. The 2024 Veterinary Genetics Laboratory panel in Davis gave that story a measurable form. 110 Whippets, 33 STR loci, 7 DLA class Y and 2 regions, and almost every allele recovered. Those numbers do more than confirm diversity. They restore depth. They show that the breed's identity was built from enough genetic room to keep its past alive, even while its form was sharpened into something unmistakable. In the end, that is why the result felt so powerful. The Whippet was never just a fast dog with a polished frame. It was a living record of how selection can concentrate appearance without erasing inheritance. The DNA did not uncover a single hidden ancestor and close the file. It opened the breed up, revealing that its beauty and speed were never separate from the complexity underneath. And once you see that, the Whippet no longer looks like a simple icon. It looks like a carefully kept history, written in motion and protected in its genes. If this deep dive into the hidden history of the Whippet surprised you, let me know in the comments. Do you have a breed that you think hides a secret like this? Don't forget to like and subscribe.